We are here with Joe Connolly to talk on the occasion of the International Labour Organization's Cooperatives Unit's centenary. Joe is someone who has worked with ILO and other international organizations on development cooperation. He's a field man and perhaps we should say hello and welcome to you, Joe, and let you introduce yourself.
Hello, Joe Connolly here. For those in ILO, you probably know me from various projects since the 80s, from Zambia to Tanzania, Somalia, Sri Lanka, and then various countries on short-term assignments in between. Yeah, and that's my kind of history with ILO as a project manager, as a technical cooperation person. As well as that, I've been working with private consultants in the construction sector, roads and infrastructure in Africa originally. And then before that, I worked in a wide range of jobs. My first job at the age of 9, no child labor, was working on commercial fishing boats with my uncle. So fishing, sailing, soldier, sailor, spy, tinker, the whole lot over the time. So I've worked in construction at home. I've worked as a cleaner. I've worked as a paramedic. And when I was putting myself through college. So, and I've done various things in travel. So I think a whole lot of my background to do work with ILO and with cooperatives and so on. And I come from a family of, I think social activism would be the way to describe it. My grandfather had been, involved in the independence movement in Ireland in the 1900s and in the 1920s, and was involved in the founding of a party here, a political party. And my father was heavily involved in trade unions, but even before that, before I knew what a trade union was, he was involved in credit unions, which is a form of cooperative. So, we were from a very politically aware house, although they weren't particularly well formally educated people. They had a lot of, I remember, very strong political discussions. They had a kind of a socialist left type of background. And there used to be some very heated discussions, which as a child you absorb, you kind of to appreciate that you need to look at things and that maybe everybody is not as well off as you, and that our people are a lot better off than you. And that's how I got interested in this sort of work, or not even in the work, but just how I got the values behind me.
And you have also worked in a number of conflict, post-conflict settings. Your life path to countries which have faced civil war. How did you get involved in these contexts?
Well, as I said I didn't intend to go into conflict. I didn't say I'm going to specialize in conflict or anything like that. I had worked in countries, least developed countries like Zambia, in the north of Zambia, which was going through a big political transition at the time. And you could see the way structural adjustment programs and all were really hitting on people. It was almost a type of conflict. There was rioting, there was a breakdown at times of law and order and so on. But my real first kind of introduction to this sort of work, development work in conflict, if you can say that, was in Somalia. And there I got a call from ILO saying, would you be interested in coming to Somalia to look at the place and write up a project document, basically. ILO had been promised some funds from a donor, and Mike Sean, the retired official, he was the man responsible for it at the time. And we went to Somalia, and we went with one donor and about $1.4 million over 2 years. And that over the time. So we looked at the program, we tried to assess, it was a very complex situation. There was conflict in the south and in the east, and in the northeast of the country, while in the northwest, you know, the self-declared South Sealand, there was relative. So we were able to use that as an entry point and work on. So that was my first introduction to that conflict stroke post-conflict situation. After that, you know, we were involved in some emergency work in assessments in Kenya. Again, co-ops were a little bit involved in that. I can explain that. We were also involved then, after that, I think mainly, did I miss somewhere out? You know, I did work in the DRC. We did work in Northern Uganda, some with ILO, some with other agencies. And again, these were volatile, conflict-affected areas. And then finally was basically Sri Lanka, which was the post-Civil War context of 2009. The conflict ended in April 2009, and ILO signed a contract in June 2010, and then, or maybe slightly earlier, and then I arrived in January 2011 to start that conflict. And although they had a lot in common, these conflict situations, they're also extremely unique. Somalia was totally different than the DRC. The DRC is different than Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was very unique, you know? And that was the background. And in those places, there are many challenges, but there's also many opportunities. The challenges, of course, are just the pure logistics and the security and so on and so on. And being a project manager, ensuring that the safety of staff, national and international staff, ensuring that what you're doing, that you do a thorough risk assessment and you begin to understand the potential complexities of the work you're involved in, and the potential negative effects, or even ignition effects, you might say, that something you may do on a local level can blow up into something much bigger and reignite conflict or cause death and so on. So you have to be very conscious of that. The opportunities, of course, is that you're often working in an area with who are desperate. The people are desperate for some sort of development work, some sort of assistance. So you usually have very receptive communities, the ordinary people. The challenges and also the opportunities is that you often have local authorities that can be completely rapacious almost, you know. They're not there they're part of the conflict. And at the same time, you may have weak institutions, so you can help often rebuild those institutions if you get good rapport with the guys who are starting off, because you often have to see it from their context. You know, you may be their only potential source of income. I don't mean personal income, I mean income for a whole ministry, a small project. And so you have the leverage there to put in and to set up good practices and to start through very practical ways, starting to introduce some of the policies and some of the how would you say, the value issues of ILO at the beginning, you know, like decent work, like trying to get people into social protection, like setting up good, open, transparent recruitment practices. So there's always opportunities in each of these, and there's always challenges. And I think that's what you have to be able to get on the ground and try and assess and listen to what's being said, listen to what's not being said, and then trying to, try to get it right. And at the same time, make sure that you're not putting yourself or your staff into taking undue risks, and also not putting the host communities you're working with into undue risks that you may not even be aware of. So you have to be quite cautious. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, when I look back on Somalia, it was a very demanding, on a personal level, I was away from my family a lot, a very demanding environment, because you were never off duty. You know, you were working in Nairobi during the week, but then you were going to, for a few days, and you go to Somalia for 10 or 12 days, and you never switched off. And then when you came back to Nairobi, you were still on the phone to Somalia. When I went on leave, I used to bring a satellite phone with me, because there was always something would happen. You know, we had staff had been kidnapped, we had different things like that. So maybe I overdid it. Maybe I didn't get the balance right at the time, but that's retrospection. That's 10, 15 years later, you know. But you have to have that commitment, and yeah. And I think it's also good if you're aware of, if you have some awareness of the potential hazards in conflict. I know from Sri Lanka we had a big mine contamination problem, and a lot of unexploded ordnance. Now, many of my Tamil staff, I grew up with this stuff. You know, they were used to demining areas and so on. But my emphasis with them was, you know, we don't operate. We had the mine action protocols, but we also had additional protocols ourselves. So we were told, yeah, we can go in and have a look at this mill to, you know, it's been reopened. But we went in and we did our own checks by asking people and by looking for signs. And if we weren't happy, so those sort of things were good, and the staff appreciated that. But anyway, that's conflict. I mean, generally speaking, great challenges, but huge opportunities and great potential to get something going, to get new ideas in, to try and challenge some of the reasons perhaps why that conflict was occurring. Inequalities, land issues, natural resource issues. You know, these are the issues that you have to do it subtly. You cannot make enemies. There's enough enemies there, but you have to work with all parties. And this is where co-ops can come in. That's, you know.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I mean, in a context, a post-conflict context where trust between communities may have been broken, how do you bring an institution, an enterprise form that is very much based on solidarity, mutualism, collaboration?
How do you do it? You know, again, context is the issue. If I was talking about, I mentioned to you about Kenya and cooperatives. One time I was doing a mission with one of our former colleagues, Alfredo Lazarte, and Stephen Matua, who's a Kenyan guy. And we went to Lake Victoria, that had been affected really badly by flooding. Thousands and thousands of kilometers, hundreds of thousands of people washed out of houses, livelihoods lost. And we were talking to a fishermen's cooperative on Lake Tanganyika. And I remember they had received a substantial amount of money from Madonna, who will remain nameless. And I asked them, you know, well, when do you vote? And who has the votes and so on, you know? And they said, well, if you have 10 votes, you have 10 votes. And if you have 20 votes, and I said, well, who owns the boats? Well, the boats were owned by one of the exporters and a few politicians, and a few were owned by the fishermen. And I said, you really don't have a co-op here. And, you know, so in that context, in the context of Kenya, I'd be very cautious about what co-ops can do in that sort of environment. And, you know, sometimes but there's also very good examples in Kenya of good co-ops. But in Somalia, for example, the co-ops were very much clan-based co-ops. And again, they didn't have the same they didn't comply with the general principles of cooperatives. But they were, and we tried to work with them, and it was very difficult. Now, I know FAO are continuing that work, and they're going on, and I don't know how genuine those cooperatives are. So I found it difficult in Somalia. In Sri Lanka, particularly in the north, there was a great culture of co-ops that had gone back, you know, over, I don't know, 100 years or something. During the war, the cooperatives had in fact they had been kept active, but they had lost some of their co-op ethos. They had become service providers for NGOs and for humanitarian agencies, and also for the Tamil Tigers and also for the government in many ways. They were like conduits. They brought in food aid and they brought out fish and, you know, that sort of thing. There was trade going on. And they became businesses in many ways, but they still had that cooperative mentality, but the practices and the ethos was being lost. When we went back in 2000, when we started in 2011, we found at the grassroots level that there was a great empathy for co-ops, understanding of co-ops among the ordinary people. Now, part of this was because during the war and near the end of the war, as the Sri Lankan army advanced, the people were taken from their homes and put into IDP camps. And I think the IDP camps were, I wasn't in any of them, but you know, I passed by them, and I spoke to many colleagues who had been in them from other agencies. And they were, when we got there, a lot of them were being opened up, and the people had returned, and there was maybe 70% of the people had returned back to their homes. But they were horrific places, huh? Just the pure logistics, people on top of each other, you know, very close proximity, water being supplied by some aid agency, food being supplied by another aid agency, education by another agency, a lot of lack of privacy, you know, in many ways prisoners but not prisoners, and I think a whole loss of human dignity for people. I mean, parents in particular, how would it seem as if how would it seem to children when they see that everything has been provided by other people rather than their parents? So the people, the men in particular, but also the women, had also lost that sense of self-respect. And that's my opinion, totally subjective. I'm not I don't know what, a sociologist or a philosopher on this, but this is what I could see. When they returned back to their places, their farms or their villages, their fishing villages, they basically returned to a landscape and to nothing. Their houses had been destroyed. There wasn't a building more than 3 blocks high anywhere. So they were in temporary accommodation, tents, and so on. Many of the area, you know, the farming area, a lot of it was contaminated, but I must say between, you know, that was being cleared by demining people. They were getting food grants, they were getting inputs from various agencies, but they were, I don't know if the term is traumatized, but they were definitely not in a position to take charge of their own lives. Huh? Partly it was also a great fear. They had a great fear of the security forces. There was a presence there, and nobody wanted to take a leadership role. They were like, they all had ideas. They'd speak to you privately, but they wouldn't take that initiative forward. So, but they would get together in a type of co-op, you know, and there was a Department of Cooperative Development there. So, and that's what we saw, the co-ops as a means of getting the people together and getting them to start expressing a voice. And that's what I think we achieved. In other words, it was an element of social solidarity, confidence building, but most important, and I keep emphasizing, this idea of empowerment. From a situation of being totally disempowered, not being able to look after your family, not being able to look after your own life, or your wife's, or a wife look after you, or a husband, whatever. The whole idea of helplessness and being stuck in an IDP camp, and then later on waiting for NGOs or agencies to come and feed them, and so on and so on. This whole sense of disempowerment and loss of dignity is the issue that I think all our development work in many cases should be, not all of our development work, the development work in these cases should be aimed at. Yes, we have to do that, we have to get some sort of economic empowerment, because it's no good talking about dignity if you're dirt poor all the time, you know, they can't eat dignity. But you need to get the livelihoods going, get the jobs going, but at the same time work on this empowerment, you know, work on this idea that people can take control and have some control over their own lives. So I know I ramble on a bit, and I apologize if I do, but that's the issue.
And these were mainly producer cooperatives, Joe?
Yeah, they were mainly producer cooperatives. Initially, we began with producer cooperatives, farmers small farmers on 1 and 2 acres, half an acre, some of them even. We started off with women. There was 70% of our 60 something percent of their initial 200 farmers when we started off the papaya scheme were women. And in that society, Tamil conservative patriarchal society, I know the patriarchy is the issue now, but this was very true there. It was a life-changing impact on, it had a life-changing impact on them because they assumed leadership roles in cooperatives, which they would never have done before. They opened bank accounts. They started getting money into their account. A lot of them were widows and young widows, you know, in their late 20s, early 30s with young children. And in Tamil society, and if any Tamil or Hindu expert they can contradict me if they wish, but they're probably better. They have more knowledge than I have. But in the society that I saw, women who were widowed were kind of ostracized. They were not allowed to wear certain clothes, certain color saris, for example. When you had a meeting, they would sit at the back of the meeting. And then they had the additional problem that they were poor and they were trying to get children to school so their children wouldn't have access to education. And then there was the whole military presence, and also not only from the military, but also from locals, because they were widows. There was a kind of a feeling, I got the feeling that they were considered fair game, if you know what I mean, by men. There was that element of sexual coercion or something going on. So it's an issue that I'm not qualified to talk about, you know, in detail, but that was the feedback I got from my staff who were locals, and also from talking with other guys and people and listening to what was going on. So as well as getting, you know, the first thing was get some money into their pocket so they know how they're going to eat tomorrow, the following week, the next 6 weeks, get some assets there, get some savings. They eventually all opened bank accounts, which they never had before. And then look at the institutional issues that prevented them opening bank accounts or registering businesses, which we did at district level. So that was and that I'm particularly happy with within the project. It got people, men and women, who had no assets, starting off from scratch, and now they have bank accounts and they are putting people in scholarships and things like this. You know, that was now that may have happened without our intervention, I think, but it would have taken a hell of a lot longer, and it may not have happened. And I think in many ways it would not have happened.
What was the role of the project as it relates to the market links, establishing these markets for these products that were produced by the women and men members of the cooperative?
Well, a legacy of the 30-year war in Sri Lanka was that you had a well-developed south, the southern part, which was run by the government, the Sri Lanka government, which was mainly Sinhalese, and it was well-developed economic sector. It had diversity, it had financial services, banking services, extension services, and market linkages. In the north, you had an agricultural system that, because of the war, had no access to markets. Productivity levels were very poor, and yet it was one of the most potentially productive areas, at very fertile soil and so on and so on. And you also had a very hardworking people in the north. These people are extremely hardworking. So what we saw happening after the peace, and maybe a year or so after when we arrived, even when we arrived, the infrastructure was being developed by the government. They were putting in railways, roads at a fantastic pace, and they were doing a really good job in terms of quality, time, and speed. You know, they were really working well. But what we saw happening was that we could see the well-developed agro sector coming up to the north, and they were going to use the north as potentially as a source of cheap produce. Because what was happening was the farmers were getting back on the land, They were getting free inputs from various agencies, FAO, UNHCR, all the various NGOs were giving them inputs. They were growing things. There was a surplus. And then they had to sell them at below cost of production prices. So that would work when there were subsidies, but it wouldn't work in the long term. So one of the things, also and I have to be cautious here, but one of the reasons for the conflict, it's usually there, is they say there were perceptions of inequality by the North from the South. The Tamils felt that they were treated unequally. Whether that's true or false is another debate. And there is some credence in that. There is some truth in it. So what was going to happen if, what would have been the case if the well-developed agro sector, which was also providing, fertilizer and machinery and tractors and plows and so on, as well as wanting to start purchasing their crops, what would have been the context, or what would have been the result of that? Well, what would have happened would be they would have come up, they would have bought the produce at cheap cost because there were so many surpluses, and they would have provided inputs, and the North would have got poorer, and the perceptions of inequality would have persisted, maybe even been exacerbated. And in my opinion, you would have had another conflict in 25 years' time. That would have been, we were setting up for another conflict. So we had to tackle those inequalities. And it wasn't confined to one ethnic group in the South either. The Sinhalese and the Tamils and the Muslims are equally capable of exploiting their own people. There's no doubt about that. So we tried to, so that was the thinking behind our developing markets. So we went to the top politician in the country at the time, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Economic Development. And we also went to the top agro companies. And we put this argument to them. We said, if you see the North as just a source of cheap produce, perceptions of inequality will be exacerbated and you'll have another war in 25 years' time. And this is not sustainable for Sri Lanka. So we need you to think about a different model of engagement. And of the major companies we spoke to, only 2 were interested in coming up. And in that sort of scenario. And at that time, as I often say, the smell of gun smoke was still over the battlefield. There was mines and there was problems with military and access issues and so on. Anyway, one company came up, they were a big fruit exporter, and that started the whole ball rolling. And that was our famous CRE exports, and they started the ball rolling. Once they started going, we then contacted National Chamber of Exporters, and we had good cooperation with them. They were fairly proactive. Mr. Shehan Manakar, he is the chief executive of it now. And they were up and they were bringing people up the North, and they were giving the same message. The perceptions of inequality. We need a different thing. Now, from our part, we had to also help to try and organize farmers, because farmers were small growers, 2 acres, 1 acre, half an acre type farms. So for an exporter, it's very difficult to deal with 300 farmers, on half an acre. It's much easier for him to deal with 2 farmers on 150 acres each. But that would have defeated the whole purpose of it. So our job was to try and get these cooperatives working, get them organized, work with the Department of Agriculture in the North, who were brilliant. The Department of Agriculture up there are top-class people. We were able to work with them. We were able to act as the interlocutor between the exporters and the co-ops. At the same time, we were working with the Department of Cooperative Development to get the co-ops, and we were on the ground ourselves. I mean, every week we were talking to co-ops, and we did it 2 and 3 years later, encouraging, motivating, trying to see where the problems are before they arrive, looking at different, and with the Sri Lankan, with the co-ops, it was often a case of us trying to keep up with them, because we'd sow a seed and the next thing they'd have gone with it, or they might be sowing seeds with us. Would you like to, do you think this would be possible? And we were looking at all sorts of innovative things. Before, in 2017, we were talking to people about the black ink from squid, you know, that they use in some sort of pasta, but is also used for, now they're finding it could be used in some sort of cancer treatment. Now, it's a very select, narrow market, but there are hundreds of tons of it, I suppose, is wasted every year along the coast. And these are the sort of things, you know, we were able to get on the internet, we'd pick up the phone and ring a guy in Spain. Hello, we're from Sri Lanka. We want to have a chat with you. Yeah, will you come? Yeah, boom. They'd come, you know. That's the sort of thing we were able to do on the market access. I'm not sure, you know, but in Sri Lanka itself, once we got the ball moving, then other companies started coming on board because they could see the potential business. And that's what happened. It built a momentum of its own. And, you know, I don't know how many exporters there are there now. But there's also a lot of local markets too, which they've access to. But more importantly, the co-ops are in a position where they can negotiate. They understand prices. They can negotiate. They understand a bit more about markets. If an exporter wants 100 tons of X, Y, or Z each month, he needs 100 tons each month, and we have to get organized to provide that at this quality, this shape, this size, this color, this packaging. So they understood that, and I think that was a big achievement. But the main thing was empowering the cooperatives so they can negotiate.
Thanks, Joe. What do you think is the role of the ILO as the International Labor Organization, a tripartite institution? What do you think is the value added of the ILO in such settings, but also as it relates to, for instance, working with local institutions like cooperatives?
I think ILO, I say we, but ILO has a huge potential, which in many cases, I've been very critical, it doesn't utilize enough. One is that in Sri Lanka, we had the Employers Federation of Ceylon, for example. We worked with them. They were great at providing contacts, access, you know, to politicians, to decision makers, to various institutions, to the Exporters Association. They were able to help us there. Also to Chambers of Commerce, and through the Chambers of Commerce then to the Seafood Exporters Association, for example. Also, ILO is perceived by many governments, host governments, not just as a development agency. It's a development agency, perhaps not the best development agency, I must say, by partners, by national governments, but as somebody with whom they have been working for a long time, before the crisis, maybe during and after the crisis, or before it was ever. I mean, many of these countries have been in you know, members of ILO for many, many years, since they gained independence. I think in Sri Lanka in 1947 or something like this. So they have that relationship, and there's been an ILO office there, and they've been helping them to do things like you know, occupational health and safety, wage levels, equal pay for equal work. And also, although I have expressed skepticism in times about international labor conferences and the worth of them, in the long term, they're probably worthwhile in some way. Maybe not as big as they are now or they were, but insofar as there is a constant contact each year at a high level with the government, with the chambers, and with the trade unions, with each other and with the ILO. So I think in the case of Sri Lanka, it was really advantageous for the ILO and for me as a project manager to have the ILO behind us, because we weren't there just doing a project or a program. We had a longer term relationship. And, you know, I also think from an ILO background, we should be thinking all the time about policy, recommendations, and so on, and conventions, because although I would be my first person to put my hand up and say sometimes I don't think too much about it, in the background I think we do a project, we implement a project, maybe to, you know, to provide incomes for people. That's one level. At another level, we're empowering people and organizations to empower them so they can get better wages or get better produce and so on, and they can take decisions for life. But then we're also using, at that level, using also our work on the ground to influence decision makers and policy makers at national level, or even in the case of Sri Lanka, at global level. We went beyond the national level. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind, and that's what ILO should be doing. And I think that's what we're well equipped to do, because we have people who have drafted this sort of stuff who can say, oh, but there is a policy on ABC there, you know, there is a policy on fair trade, there is a policy on, and this is what we've done. We're not just doing programs or projects. But from a very practical level, I mean, in Somalia, the first time in Somalia, I met the then Minister of Labour. There's been about 6 governments since then, or 10 governments, I don't know. But I was able to go in and meet him straight away in Mogadishu, under unbelievable security at the time when I think about it. But we were able to make that contact. The same in the Somaliland. We were able to meet the Minister of Labour, and he was our contact. And we had very good relations with him, and he opened up a huge access for us. One good thing is that the Ministry of Labour in many countries is considered a kind of a neutral ministry, insofar it's not fighting for resources like the Ministry of Works or the Ministry of Commerce, or it's not a high profile ministry. But in actual fact, its tentacles, like all labour conditions and labour law and so on, they run through a lot of ministries. So if you're clever, you can use the Ministry of Labour to do a lot of things and to make lots of access. And the Ministry of Labour can use you as well, and that's what they do, you know. So that's the big advantage, I think, with ILO on this thing, you know. And also we have a long history. We're not a fly-by-night organization. It's 100 years, you know, and there's a good reason why it's there. Much, I think, on that.
So